Well, hello. My name is David Brushwood, and today what we're going to do is have a class on Introduction to Pharmacy Regulation, the basics of why pharmacy is what we call, quote, the most regulated health profession, close quote. And it causes us to wonder, why are the regulators picking on us? Why are they singling us out from among the other health professions? Or are they really? Maybe they're not singling us out. But if they aren't, why does it feel that they are? So we're going to try to explore this perception, perhaps reality, that pharmacy is the most regulated health profession, figure out why it is that pharmacy is the most regulated health profession, or that it seems like we are, and if so, what we can do to meet the expectations of regulators who aren't going to go away, whose responsibility it is for us to work together with them so that we can help them achieve their goals as they help us achieve our goals. So we have 3 learning objectives for today. First of all, we'll discuss the purpose of pharmacy regulation. There has to be a purpose for government action. Government shouldn't do anything to restrict the freedom of citizens within a society unless there's a purpose for it. And the overall purpose of pharmacy regulation is to protect the public health, to assure that drugs are safe, that drugs are effective, that they're being used safely and used effectively. So what we'll focus on as we discuss the possibility, perhaps reality, that pharmacy is the most regulated health profession is whether the purpose is being achieved of pharmacy regulation. Second, we'll discuss the importance of balance in the regulation of pharmacy. It's always important to be moderate in everything we do. Just as we balance ourselves when we walk, just as we balance work with home life, just as we balance pretty much everything we do, regulators need to balance being too aggressive with being too soft. Thirdly, we'll describe how regulatory agencies are held accountable for their performance. Just as regulators have expectations of us, the public has expectations of regulators, and they are answerable to the public, requiring that the regulators show that things they do are productive rather than counterproductive. So one thing we need to do in pharmacy is understand how it is that they show their productivity so that we can work with them so that our success is their success. So let's ask this fundamental question. Why do regulators focus so much on pharmacy? Why is it that there are so many rules that apply to us in pharmacy that don't seem to apply to other healthcare professionals, like physicians, for example, like dentists, like nurses, like others in healthcare? Well, I think at least part of the answer is that unlike most of these other professions, pharmacists have to observe regulatory requirements that relate to the professional practitioner themselves, the pharmacists, but also the product that we control, that we touch. Physicians and nurses don't necessarily touch the product, but we almost always do. We are very product focused, and the product has some regulations that are important for us to know and follow. And then the practice site, where the practitioner conducts professional practice. There are rules and regulations regarding that practice site as well. So we get kind of a triple whammy here in pharmacy in that from a regulatory perspective, there's a focus on the individual practitioner, the pharmacist, who has to be competent, who has to be licensed, who has to follow specific rules, the drug product that has to be safe and effective, the handlers of which, the dispensers of which, have to make sure that specific rules are followed, and the practice site, the place where professional people practice what they do. It has to follow certain requirements to make sure that it is offering to the professionals, the pharmacists, the opportunities to succeed, that the materials are available, that the equipment is serviceable and up to date. So let's now consider the sources of pharmacy law. Where do these laws come from? Well, of course, it's well known that we have both federal and state laws. So when a pharmacist is looking for the answer to a question, and that question probably can be answered in the law, the pharmacist has to go both to federal and state law and find out what is the answer either in one or the other, or perhaps both, which may conflict. And if there is a conflict, then as a general rule, the more strict law applies. Now, in federal law, of course, what we have is the United States Constitution. This is a marvelous set of agreed-on principles that has existed, not been amended that many times, for several centuries. And we have certain rights that are given to us as citizens within this marvelous document, this Constitution, this expression of principles, one of which, for example, is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech in pharmacy means that we have the right to advertise the products and the prices of the products that we offer. There was a challenge to this. The government in Virginia, one of the states that regulates pharmacy, said, you can't advertise prices. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, no, under the Constitution, pharmacists may do that. United States Congress passed a compounding law that said pharmacists can't advertise their compounding services. That went to the Supreme Court of the United States again. The Supreme Court said, no, government, you can't do that. You can't restrict speech. So pharmacists have freedom of speech. We know this because the Constitution says so, and the Supreme Court of the United States has interpreted the Constitution and reinforced that this is a fact. Now, no right, no freedom is absolute. The government has said that there is certain confidential information about patients that can't be spoken freely to everyone. So pharmacists under the HIPAA law are not free to go around their community or go around the country and speak to people about patients, about their medical history without authorization from the patient to do that. And one might say, wait a minute, that is a restriction on freedom of speech. I thought under the Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court of the United States, pharmacists have freedom of speech. We should be able to talk to people about patients when we know things about these patients that are important to share. And if that were to go to the Supreme Court would say, whoa, 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 wait a minute, there's some limits. There are some limits on what you can say because no right is absolute. Every right is subject to the existence of another right, and patients have a right of privacy. Their right of privacy trumps your right of freedom of speech. So we always have to look at this balance that begins with the Supreme Court of the United States and its interpretation of the Constitution and extends through just about every other regulatory activity that exists. Now, in addition to the Constitution at the federal level, we have statutes that are enacted by Congress. The United States Congress, the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate, they get together and they pass bills, and these bills become laws. One of them is the Controlled Substances Act. Another one is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Yet another one is the Social Security Act. And all of these have implications for pharmacy. These are broad. They're enabling. They provide a general framework for regulation. They don't have specifics. The specifics come in regulations promulgated by administrative agencies. Whereas members of Congress are businessmen or lawyers or bankers or homemakers or in some way very knowledgeable generally of the way government acts. They're not specific experts in healthcare or drug therapy. So for those specifics, regulators turn to administrative agencies like the Drug Enforcement Administration or the Food and Drug Administration, or for the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. These administrative agencies are implementing. They have specific expertise that they apply rather than creating a general framework. At the state level, there is a similar framework. We have practice acts from state legislatures like the Pharmacy Practice Act or the Medicines Act or a variety of other statutes that come from the state Senate and state House of Representatives. Again, just as is the case with the federal framework, these are enabling and provide a general framework. And then we have regulations, a set of rules that are more specific, that are implementing, that come from state agencies such as the Board of Pharmacy or the Department of Health. How do you find these laws? Well, unfortunately, the reality is they're hard to find. There is generally no one place you can go to and find these laws. There are some excellent textbooks on pharmacy law that bring together all of the laws, federal and state, statutes and regulations. But the problem with them is that the law is ever changing, and as soon as you publish a really good book, it's going to be out of date necessarily because changes occur. So in order to find what's most up to date for federal legislation, the enabling framework, what you really need to do is go to the Congressional Record. Congressional Record is updated every day. It publishes the workings of United States Congress when Congress is in session. And it has the background of laws. It has the wording of laws. It has the legislative history of the laws. So you can begin to understand not just what the laws are, but what the laws mean by looking at the Congressional Record, what the intent was of them. Those laws then are codified, are put together in a systematic taxonomy that is known as the United States Code, the USC. If you see references to USC, it's the United States Code. It's organized. So if you're looking for something about drugs or about pharmacy within federal law, what you're probably going to do is go to 21 USC or 42 USC, not to some of the other areas of the United States Code that have no relevance or very little relevance to pharmacy practice. It's an organized way, just sort of like the card catalog is at the library, of finding things you want and sorting out things that you don't want. Federal regulations, those that apply specific expertise, also can be found on a day-to-day basis in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is the regulatory analog to the Congressional Record, which is the statutory application of information. Just as the United States Code codifies legislation, the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, codifies regulations. It organizes them. And so what pharmacists who are looking for regulations applicable to them would likely do is go to 21 CFR, 21 Code of Federal Regulations, or 42 CFR to find what they need. These laws are made available on websites of the DEA and the FDA. The DEA statute and regulations are on their website, deadiversion.usdoj.gov, and the CEDAR website has FDA statutes and regulations, fda.gov/drug/default.htm. So these are places to go to find federal laws that are applicable to pharmacy. Finding state laws is a little bit more of a challenge, simply because there are 50 different places to go rather than one. But this is made a little bit easier by the fact that the state laws are aggregated by the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. I mean, one thing you can do is just go to the NABP website, nabp.net. And if you do that, what you're going to discover is that they list the websites of all of the 50 state boards of pharmacy. So you can then go to those state board of pharmacy websites and find what you need. NABPLAW is a commercial product that's available for sale that can be purchased, where NABP does that for you by having on a specific product all of the laws that you might otherwise have to find on your own by going to each of the State Board of Pharmacy websites. When you go to the state websites, State Board of Pharmacy websites, looking for applicable state law, you're going to have to look at the statutes and the regulations both, because there might be appropriate and relevant law for you in either of those two places. But also, what's really nice about State Board of Pharmacy websites is that many of them contain informal guidance. Informal guidance where they actually help you understand what these laws mean. I mean, you look at these statutes and regulations, and even if you've spent decades, as I have, studying them and trying to understand them, I look at them and I can't figure them out. And actually, what I think they mean isn't nearly as important as what the State Board of Pharmacy thinks they mean. So what state boards in many states will do is tell you what they think their laws mean. And they do that through informal guidance that you can find on State Board of Pharmacy websites. Now, not all states do this. Some states are forbidden to do it, but many states do. and it's very useful to find when it's available. There are other state agencies, of course. It's not just the State Board of Pharmacy that regulates pharmacy practice, but the State Department of Health may have some statutes and regulations that are of relevance. The State Drug Control Authority may have some statutes and regulations that are of relevance. So there are a lot of places that have to be gone to. Most of these are listed on State Board of Pharmacy websites, so they give you a direct link to the place you need to go. Let's talk for a minute about the many roles of administrative agencies. There's this really interesting area of regulation that is occupied by what we call administrative agencies. Administrative agencies really are located in the executive branch of government. There's the legislative branch and the judicial branch, in addition to the executive branch. But the executive branch manages in certain ways to impinge on the legislative and judicial branches through the activities of its administrative agencies. And we need to figure out how the balance of power among the three branches of government becomes just a bit skewed in favor of the executive branch as a result of the activities of administrative agencies. For one thing, administrative agencies have a legislative role. They make rules. They make rules that implement the general guidelines that come from the legislature. They have an interpretive role. They provide guidance to the regulated practitioners in industry. We talked about that a minute ago. The administrative agencies help practitioners, industry, members of industry who are regulated, understand what the expectations are by the regulators. Then they have an enforcement role. To a certain degree, they're the cops. Administrative agencies conduct routine inspections, and they respond to complaints. When a citizen is unhappy about something that a regulated professional or regulated business has done, they can complain to the administrative agency, which will investigate. They also have a judicial role. So to a certain extent, administrative agencies occupy the space both of the legislative branch and the judicial branch of government, because legislative agencies conduct evidentiary hearings in order to decide whether a rule has been broken. Their decisions can be appealed to courts of law. So if a pharmacist or another regulated health professional or business feels that an administrative agency has simply missed the boat, misunderstood, not done their job well in conducting an evidentiary hearing and issuing an opinion, a ruling as a result of that hearing, then there can be an appeal. So that sort of restores the balance among the branches of government, giving the courts the last say on activities of administrative agencies. Courts do, though, grant substantial deference to administrative agencies, although you can appeal if you're aggrieved by an activity conducted by an administrative agency. You can go to a court and say, I think they were wrong. Chances are pretty good that the deck is a bit stacked against you, because administrative agencies have a tendency to say, well, we are the experts in this area, and courts have a tendency to say, you know, you're right. You understand it better than we do, so you, administrative agency, in the interpretation you have made, have greater expertise than we do, so we grant deference to you in the application of your laws. Let's consider the role of the courts. The courts serve as this impartial interpreter of disagreements that may exist, different kinds of disagreements that occur. And first of all, let's talk about this idea of administrative review. The idea that administrative agencies may take an action against a licensee or a permittee, against an individual or a business, and that individual or business may disagree with the activity of the agency and go to the courts with that disagreement, asking for resolution of it by the courts. We've already seen that courts grant substantial deference to administrative agencies, but there are limits to that deference, because sometimes administrative agencies exceed the scope of their legislative authority. They go beyond what they are authorized to do by the legislature. Legislatures create administrative agencies and give them responsibilities, and sometimes administrative agencies do things that aren't authorized to them by the legislature. And if that's the case, a court is likely to say, hey, look, you've exceeded the scope of your legislative authority. We're going to overturn the decision that you have made. Another way that courts may take issue with administrative agencies in their review of them is by determining that the agency's action wasn't based on fact. It wasn't based on evidence, but instead it was arbitrary and capricious. It was whimsical. It was not solid. There was no good foundation to it. And for that reason, administrative agencies in making decisions explain the reason for their decisions, but a court may say, your explanation's insufficient. We think it's arbitrary. We think it's whimsical. We think there's bias associated with it. So courts play an important role in reviewing administrative agency activity, but that's not all they do. Courts oversee criminal prosecutions of healthcare professionals, criminal prosecutions of patients, criminal prosecutions of businesses. This is under the principle of retributive justice, retribution for wrongs done to society. There may be a rules violation that perhaps caused harm, or perhaps didn't cause harm to someone, but regardless, the violation of that rule, whether or not harm was caused, can result in a fine or incarceration as a result of criminal prosecution as overseen by courts of law. Then there's civil liability. Civil liability is corrective justice, putting a person who was harmed back into the situation they otherwise would have been in had the harm not been caused to them. Corrective justice. Now, if a pharmacist does something that causes a patient to lose vision or causes a patient to be incapacitated in some way, the pharmacist can't really undo what was done, but what courts require in civil liability is the payment of money, the transfer of currency, of United States dollars to the person who was harmed because the standard of care was not met. Unlike criminal prosecution, where there need not be harm, in civil liability there must be for there to be liability. Something that it's important for us to recognize is that courts are well positioned to make decisions on specific issues, but they don't make general policy well. They make it, but they do it poorly. So basically what courts are doing when they're resolving a disagreement between a patient, for example, and a pharmacist, the patient saying, for example, that the pharmacist should have warned me about this adverse effect of this medication, what they're doing is looking very specifically at that incident and deciding whether, under these facts, at this time, the pharmacist had a duty to warn of this adverse effect and failed to meet that duty. They're not considering the broader issue of pharmacists' general duty to warn about a variety of other adverse effects to other patients under other circumstances. Sometimes decisions by courts are viewed as precedent for other decisions that follow. And sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't work so well, because those decisions that follow, those cases that follow, may be very, very different from the ones that preceded them. So let's consider some general themes in pharmacy regulation. The first of these is state paternalism. The state is acting paternalistically in order to help people who can't necessarily help themselves. It used to be that in small societies in colonial America, everybody knew what was going on and were able to help themselves well. In this national stream of commerce we now have, it's much more difficult for people to help themselves, and instead government has stepped in paternalistically and said, we're going to help you, even if you haven't asked us to help you. State paternalism is benevolent action taken on behalf of the public without necessarily seeking or considering public input. So the government, for example, might say, we're not going to permit a certain drug to be on the market at all. Or we're going to permit this drug to be on the market, but we're going to put heavy restrictions on it. And the public might say, gosh, why are you doing that? We need better access to that drug. And the government would say, no, we know better than you do what you need, actually. And we're being benevolent toward you. We're acting on your behalf. And we're not really considering this input of yours because we, the government, have better expertise than you do about you. There's the central principle of balance that's a theme throughout pharmacy, also known as the Goldilocks principle. Regulation needs to not be too hard, needs not to be too soft, but needs to be just right, just like Goldilocks. And we'll look in just a minute at a couple of examples of how it is that government has to get it just right. Regulatory outcomes. The public is asking of their government agencies for evidence that the government agencies are producing good outcomes. They're asking government agencies to justify their existence. How do we know that we're better off because we have a state board of pharmacy? How do we know that we're better off because we have a state department of health? How do we know that we're better off because we have a Food and Drug Administration? And government agencies are having to justify themselves by showing evidence that the outcomes of their activities produce good results for the public. That's regulatory outcomes and is a theme in pharmacy regulation. Regulatory capture is another theme in pharmacy regulation. This relates to the possibility that a regulatory agency, a government agency, could become the alter ego of the regulated industry. Some people have suggested, for example, that the Food and Drug Administration is the alter ego of the big pharma industry. I don't believe that myself. I'm not one who adheres to that idea. But there are some people who do. And essentially what they're saying is that the pharma industry has captured the Food and Drug Administration. There are some people who say that the pharmacy practitioners, pharmacists, have captured the State Board of Pharmacy, that the State Board of Pharmacy doesn't act for the public, that the State Board of Pharmacy acts for the profession of pharmacy. And sometimes you hear people say, this is a mistaken thing for them to say, some people say the State Board of Pharmacy did that and I disagree with it because it's not good for pharmacy. Well, it's not supposed to be good for pharmacy. What the State Board of Pharmacy does is supposed to be good for the public, not for the Board of Pharmacy. If what the State Board of Pharmacy did was intended to be good for the profession of pharmacy, that would be a case of regulatory capture. Now let's consider what economists and regulatory theorists refer to as reasons to regulate. Theorists have told us that market failures justify government regulation. In the absence of a market failure, there is no justification for government to regulate. And there are four basic kinds of market failures: public goods, natural monopoly, externality, and information asymmetry. Now, the problem with public goods is that you have free riders, or the potential for free riders. There are certain advantages of having national defense, an army, a navy, an air force, Marines, and of having a police force, of having a sheriff to protect us. Some people would say, well, that's great, I want all of that, but I don't want to pay for it. Let's let other people pay for it. And so government steps in and says, no, you're going to have to pay for it. If you pay taxes, you're going to have to pay for this. You can't decide not to pay the share of your taxes that would cover this expense. That would be free riding. A pharmacy application of that is vaccines. Government says if you visit a foreign country and come back to the United States, you have to be vaccinated. There are certain childhood vaccinations that are mandatory with certain exceptions, but generally they are mandatory. And the reason is because people might otherwise decide to endanger others by not being vaccinated. A second kind of market failure is a natural monopoly. The challenge with a natural monopoly is that the capital outlay is huge, and the benefit, the incremental benefit, is small over time. An example of this is utilities. It could cost $1 billion to install electric lines, and yet the recapture of that investment would occur only over a small amount of time. So government steps in and says, we're only going to allow one company to install electric lines or gas lines or water service or whatever it is. And a pharmacy application of a natural monopoly is new drugs. The cost of developing a new drug is huge as compared with the incremental value of the price of selling the drug. So government steps in and says, we're going to grant a patent, a market exclusivity to people who market new drugs, who develop new drugs. And in that way, we will encourage the development of new drugs. Otherwise, we wouldn't have new drugs in the absence of this market exclusivity. The market failure known as externality reflects the challenge that costs may not be included in the price of a service or a product. Pollution is an example of that. You might have a factory by a river making a product and polluting the river. And because they're not recapturing the cost of their pollution when they sell the product, people who buy the product are buying it at a low price. And government says, well, you can't do that. You have to clean up the pollution before you discharge it into the river. Include then the cost of the cleanup in the price of the product so that the price reflects the true cost. And a pharmacy application of an externality is adverse drug event prevention programs that sponsors or manufacturers are required to conduct so that the public doesn't bear the cost of adverse drug events. Rather, the sponsor or the manufacturer does, and those are then included in the price of the product. Information asymmetry is an interesting and very applicable to pharmacy market failure. It results from the technical complexity of drug therapy. And examples are that we have really three types of goods: pre-experience, experience, and post-experience. A pre-experience good, for example, is a knife. It's something that you can, before you even use it, know the value of. You can see a knife and know whether it's sharp enough for you. An experience good is something that you can't know the value of until you experience it. A meal at a restaurant, for example, or a haircut at a hair salon. These are things that you can't know whether they're good or not until you experience them. But once you do, you know pretty quickly whether it's good or not. Post-experience goods are different. Drugs are classic examples of a post-experience good. You can't know the value of it until after you have used it. Perhaps some time, considerable time after the use of it. And a pharmacy application of the information asymmetry market failure is the education and professional licensure of pharmacists. The idea that we take people who are knowledgeable of adverse drug effects and we use their information that they have to prevent harm to patients. So the regulatory goal really is to convert post-experience goods, goods that are difficult to evaluate, to pre-experience goods by using the education and knowledge and licensure of pharmacists to protect people from the consequences of drugs that they are not able to evaluate the value of based on information asymmetry. There are several threats to effective regulation. And what I'd like to do with 6 bullets on this slide is just very quickly identify 2 opposing errors under the Goldilocks effect. The Goldilocks effect being not too soft, not too hard, but just right. And the first of these is FDA new drug approval. The 2 opposing errors are to approve an unsafe drug and to not approve a safe drug. So what FDA has to do is try to balance these 2 possible errors. Monitoring the use of approved drugs is another area where there are 2 possible opposing errors. It could be that FDA will remove from the market a safe drug, but it could also be that they will leave on the market an unsafe drug. Diversion prevention by the DEA could result in 2 possible errors. One of them is denial of opioids to a pain patient who needs them. The other is provision of opioids to a diverter or abuser who doesn't need them. State departments of health deal with the possible of 2 opposing errors. What they might do is discipline hospitals that are safe or fail to discipline and correct hospitals that are unsafe. Pharmacist licensure is essentially the same. It may be that a state board of pharmacy will license and continue to license an incompetent pharmacist and fail to license or fail to continue to license a competent pharmacist. Then we have pharmacy permitting of the pharmacy rather than the pharmacist. And it might be that a high quality pharmacy will be required to modify some things it's doing, or that a poor quality pharmacy won't be required to modify the way it's doing things. So now let's talk about regulatory problem solving. From the perspective of regulatory agencies, what they want to do is pick important problems and fix them. Now that sounds easy, doesn't it? But it isn't. What agencies have done sometimes in the past is misidentify the problem and implement a solution that doesn't reflect the problem. So their goal today is to analyze the situation well and then prioritize their activities. You've heard this old joke about people who, when they go hunting, do ready, fire, aim. Well, sometimes regulatory agencies have done that as well, and they're trying not to do that in the future as perhaps they have in the past, as we all perhaps have in the past. So there's several examples of how that is important. One of which could be, and this is just a hypothetical, cut rate drug detects and reports more forged prescriptions than any other pharmacy. And what regulators might conclude from this is that cut rate is doing an excellent job of screening prescriptions, and the other pharmacies aren't doing a very good job of screening prescriptions. On the other hand, a regulatory agency might ask, if they're detecting so many of them, why do the forgers continue to go there? It may be that they're failing to detect quite a few of them as well, and that they're not necessarily any better or perhaps worse than the other pharmacies at prescription forgery detection. It might be that regulators would note that Pharmacist Smith gives recommendations to prescribers that are accepted 100% of the time. And regulators would say, wow, this is very high quality pharmacist. The other pharmacists whose recommendations aren't being accepted at a high rate aren't as good. We congratulate Pharmacist Smith. Or on the other hand, they may say, Pharmacist Smith isn't making the difficult recommendations, isn't making the difficult recommendations that patients have a right to expect of Pharmacist Smith. Regulators may discover that clinical trials at mega general medical center are consistently producing favorable results for the sponsor, and they might say, wow, good for them. Mega general medical center is doing a wonderful job. Or they might say, contrarily, mega general medical center is just giving the sponsors the answers that they want, and that's a problem. Consumer Safety Officer Jones reports the lowest compliance rate in the country. Now, you might look at that and as a regulatory agency and say, well, Officer Jones isn't doing a very good job because the lowest compliance rate in the country represents a failure of Officer Jones to conduct him or herself in an effective way. On the other hand, looking more closely at it, what one might discover is that the other consumer safety officers simply aren't reporting what it is that they are seeing in order not to look good, not to look bad, I beg your pardon. And Officer Jones doesn't worry about looking bad. Officer Jones worries about doing the right job. It might also be that regulators discover that 80% of drug A's use is off-label. And they might say, gosh, the problem is that the drug company is promoting the drug off-label. But then they might alternatively, looking closer, discover that the problem really is that the drug labeling is obsolete and something needs to be done about that. The point of this slide is that problem identification is important as a first step toward problem resolution. And you can't immediately know what the problem is, what the real problem is, without investigation. So, regulatory accountability. How is it that regulatory agencies show the public they serve that they're doing the job well? Well, first of all, what they do is they identify the risk. They tell the public, here is the risk. prescription drug abuse is an identified risk that hardly anyone disagrees with. And they pick that important problem to solve, and they say, we're going to do something about that. Then they establish high-level strategic objectives. One way to do that for prescription drug abuse, for example, that regulatory agencies have chosen is a campaign called Use Only as Directed, where they would say, we're going to make sure patients who receive opioid analgesics know they're to use these only as directed. Then the next step would be to develop low-level problem-solving projects. For example, by requiring pharmacists or pharmacy technicians to read the directions of an opioid analgesic to every patient and to emphasize 3 or 4 important points. The next thing they would do is collect and aggregate data, actually look at data, and the way that could be done, for example, would be through a prescription drug monitoring program, where they ask, are the results of what we are doing, the program we're implementing, improving the way drugs are used? They have to disaggregate and interpret these data, analyze them, and then connect the fabric. Put it all together and look at cause and effect. Look at the way drugs are used over time and ask, has this project we have implemented, reflecting the objectives we established based on the risk we identified, done what we expected it to do? Now, how do we put knowledge into practice? How do we take what we've learned from this class and put it into practice? Well, what we know is that regulators focus on structure, process, and outcomes. Structure being personnel, equipment, and supplies. Process being policies and patient interactions. And outcomes being accurate order processing, wellness, and patient satisfaction. They take all of these. Regulators look at structure as it relates to outcome, process as it relates to outcome, and outcomes themselves. And what they try to do is implement a balanced approach to regulation that reflects a balanced approach to practice. So balance is important not just in regulation, but in practice as well. Balance in practice is the key to complying with balance in regulation. So from a regulatory compliance perspective, the key objective is balance. Not doing it too hard, not doing it too soft, but getting it just right. Because this is what the regulators are looking for, just right. So how can we sum all this up? First of all, I think we need to accept the fact that pharmacy probably is the most regulated health profession. But there's some good reasons for that, and don't worry. We can handle it. We can do this. The key to success in regulatory compliance is to work together with regulators, to collaborate with them. And if we implement balance in our pharmacy practices, that's going to promote balance in their regulation. We have a common goal, which is to meet the needs of the public. Working together, we can do that. But there are some requirements on our end. First of all, we have to have an attitude of conciliation and cooperation. Antagonism doesn't get us anywhere. Second, we have to have systems that promote problem identification and resolution. Without actively organizing regulatory compliance, we can't achieve the goals we wish. And thirdly, we have to have expertise to develop and implement these effective systems. And what that means is there have to be some people who are pharmacy regulatory compliance experts, just as there are experts in medication therapy management, just as there are experts in compounding, just as there are experts in diabetes care. Pharmacy needs experts in pharmacy regulatory compliance.